Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today, we're diving into a story about a man who risked everything, his safety, his future, even his life, just for one forbidden visit and a crooked bouquet of wildflowers. What happens when love becomes more dangerous than war itself? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Hands still raw from days of hiding in the forest, slowly lowered a crooked bouquet of wildflowers beside Diep's pillow. James was standing inside the small bamboo house, the place he had promised himself he would not enter again, at least not yet. And in that fragile, breath-thin moment, the truth struck him with brutal clarity. He had just gambled everything: his plans, his safety, his future, all of it, risked for one quiet chance to stand close enough to watch her breathe. Only a few hours earlier, the forest had been unbearably still. So silent, he could hear each dry leaf crack and splinter under his boots. His shelter was barely a shelter at all, just a torn tarp stretched between two trees, a blackened circle of stones, and a dented metal pot resting over cold, long-dead ashes. No walls, no warmth, no real protection, just damp soil, biting air, and the constant awareness that if he was found out here, there would be no second escape. Once, he had been known as the son of one of the most powerful men in the region. Now, he was a fugitive in a ripped shirt, sleeves shoved up his forearms, shoes still wet from crossing the stream before dawn. Out here, the forest didn't care about bloodlines or influence. It stripped him of titles, privilege, and protection without hesitation. It reduced him to what he truly was: a man trying not to freeze before sunrise. A few steps away, on a flat stone, his notebook lay open. Its pages were filled edge to edge with tight, restless handwriting. Names of directors, departments circled, crossed out, rewritten. Arrows pointing to weak seams in the empire his father ruled. Notes about which contracts could be cut, which allies would abandon ship first, where a single, precise blow could make everything crumble. This wasn't brainstorming. This was strategy. This was war. A war meant to tear control out of the old man's hands. A war meant to buy Diep a future where fear didn't sit in her chest every morning. James tried to focus on the same line for the third time, but the words blurred. Diep's face pushed its way into his thoughts, shoving everything else aside. He saw her kneeling on the bamboo floor, carefully placing a bowl in front of him with both hands, like it mattered more than it should have. He remembered how she insisted she wasn't tired, even when her eyes were swollen and red from crying through the night. He heard her voice, soft, strained, trembling despite her attempt to stay steady. "Don't fight him because of me." As if he could separate himself from what he was. As if he could choose to be a different kind of son. His fingers tightened, and the notebook snapped shut. Above him, the forest canopy thinned just enough to reveal a streak of late afternoon sky, glowing, molten gold. If he left now, if he followed the hidden routes he had memorized in darkness, he could reach the bamboo house before the sun dipped below the hills. The thought was insane, reckless, almost suicidal. His father's men were still in the village, asking questions, smiling too much, sliding folded bills across worn wooden tables, rewarding anyone who spoke the right name. All it would take was one careless look. One child staring a second too long. One familiar face catching the wrong glimpse, and they would lead his father straight to her door. Every morning, James repeated the same warning like a prayer carved into his bones. Stay away. Staying away keeps her alive. But the image of Diep alone in that house, sitting by the narrow window, flinching at every passing motorbike, wondering whether the sound meant him or the men sent to destroy her, clawed at his chest. His breathing turned shallow. His legs refused to stay still. He shoved the notebook into his backpack and dragged the zipper closed with his heel. He scattered dirt over the faint ring of his fire until even the memory of smoke disappeared. The forest had taught him how to erase himself, just as carefully as he had once learned to knot a tie before formal dinners. With the backpack slung over one shoulder, he stepped onto the narrow path. Trees leaned inward, swallowing the light, breaking it into jagged fragments across the ground. He moved quickly, but never carelessly. Every rustle mattered. Every shift in the wind could be a warning. When the rhythm of insects and birds faltered, even for a heartbeat, he froze. As he walked, Diep's laughter followed him, echoing in his mind. He remembered awkwardly folding his long legs on her bamboo floor. Remembered how she grabbed his wrist when thunder cracked overhead, pretending she wasn't scared. Remembered the way she once teased him, half smiling, half serious. "If you ever bring me flowers," she'd said, "they'd better be ones you pick yourself, not those fancy city ones." He had laughed back then. Now those words felt like a promise burned into his bones. The forest began to thin. The path opened into a wide stretch of tall grass glowing under the sinking sun. Beyond it lay the fields, scattered rooftops, and thin threads of smoke curling into the evening sky. Somewhere within that uneven sprawl stood the bamboo house, the only place that had ever felt like home. James was about to keep moving when something caught his eye. Just off the path, a cluster of wildflowers pushed stubbornly through the weeds. White, yellow, pale purple, thin stems bending in the breeze. Uneven, messy, completely unsuited for anything elegant. Perfect. He stepped off the path and knelt. His hands were rough now, scarred by rope, bark, and cold water, but he forced them to slow, one stem at a time. A few petals fell loose into his lap. Most clung on, like her. From his backpack strap, he pulled a thin cord and tied the stems together. The bouquet came out crooked, too long on one side, too sparse on the other, colors clashing without apology. He didn't adjust it. It wasn't meant to be flawless. It was meant to be real. He imagined Diep, waking as honey-colored light slipped through her small window. Imagined her turning her head and freezing when she saw the flowers beside her pillow. The familiar chord, the faint scent of the forest, no note, no explanation. She wouldn't need one. "This is madness," James murmured, staring toward the village. His pulse hammered against the fragile stems in his hand. "But I can't stay away from you." He stood, holding the bouquet as if it might fall apart, and stepped out of the grass. Behind him, the forest waited, dark, silent, protective. Ahead lay the village, and his father's wrath. James squared his shoulders and walked toward the light. A fugitive carrying a crooked bouquet and one impossible goal: reach the bamboo house before the sun vanished. The closer James got to the village, the heavier each step felt. The tall grass gave way to packed dirt, then to the uneven paths worn down by years of bare feet, bicycles, and motorbikes. Sounds crept back into the world one by one: the distant bark of a dog, the clatter of metal pans, a radio murmuring somewhere behind closed doors. Normal life, ordinary life, the kind that now felt more dangerous than the forest ever had. He slowed his pace, letting his breathing settle. Panic would get him killed faster than his father's men ever could. Smoke drifted across the road, carrying the smell of cooking oil and wood fire. James kept his head down, shoulders slightly hunched, the way the villagers walked after long days in the fields. He'd learned quickly. Confidence drew attention. Humility made you invisible. A motorbike roared past, close enough that dust coated his boots. He didn't look up. His grip tightened around the bouquet, knuckles whitening, but he kept walking. No one called out. No one stopped him. Still, every shadow felt alive. At the edge of the village, a group of men sat around a low table outside a small shop, their laughter forced, too loud. James recognized the posture instantly. Men pretending to relax while waiting for instructions. His father's men. Clean shirts, new watches, eyes that scanned instead of smiled. James turned down a side path before they could glance his way. The bamboo house sat farther back, half hidden by banana trees and a crooked fence. He remembered the first time he'd seen it, thinking it was too small, too fragile to protect anyone from the world. Somehow, it had protected him instead. He stopped a few steps away. The door was closed. A single light glowed inside, soft and dim. His chest tightened. What if he was too late? What if someone had already come? What if this reckless decision had done the one thing he'd sworn never to allow? Put her directly in danger? James forced himself forward. Each step felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the bamboo house smelled the same as always. Herbal oil, dried grass. Something warm and familiar. Diep lay on the low bed near the window, her face pale against the pillow, lashes dark against her cheeks. She was asleep, breathing, alive. The tension drained out of him so fast his knees nearly gave way. He closed the door quietly behind him and stood there, just watching. The rise and fall of her chest, the slight furrow between her brows, even in sleep. She looked smaller somehow, as if the world had been too heavy for her lately. He didn't touch her, didn't dare. Instead, he moved slowly, carefully, and placed the bouquet beside her pillow. The wildflowers looked impossibly bright against the worn bamboo mat. Out of place, defiant. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine staying, sitting on the floor until she woke, hearing her scold him for being reckless, seeing that familiar mix of anger and relief in her eyes. But that future didn't belong to him, not yet. A soft sound made him freeze. Diep shifted, her fingers curling slightly against the blanket. James held his breath, every muscle locked. After a few seconds, her breathing evened out again. He exhaled silently. Backing away, he memorized the room like he might never see it again. The chipped bowl on the shelf, the folded blanket by the wall, the faint crack in the bamboo panel he'd once promised to fix. At the door, he paused. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure whether he meant for leaving, for coming, or for everything in between. "And I swear, this won't be for nothing." Then he slipped out into the night. The village had changed while he was inside. Lamps glowed brighter, voices drifted through the air. Somewhere, someone laughed. James stayed close to the shadows, moving along paths he'd marked in his memory long ago. He was almost clear when a familiar voice carried across the road. "Hey, you there?" James didn't turn. Boots crunched closer. Too close. "You new around here?" the man asked casually, but there was an edge beneath the words. James slowed. Just enough. Passing through. A pause. Long enough to feel dangerous. "What's in your hand?" James glanced down, as if noticing the bouquet for the first time. "Flowers." Another pause, then a soft chuckle. "Strange thing to carry at night." James shrugged. "For someone who matters." The man studied him. James could feel the weight of that gaze like a blade pressed between his shoulders. Then finally, the footsteps shifted away. "Careful who you give them to," the voice said. "Not everyone likes surprises." James kept walking until the sounds faded behind him. Only when the village lights thinned did he break into a run. He didn't stop until the forest swallowed him whole. Deep among the trees, he bent over, hands braced on his knees, lungs burning. Sweat soaked his shirt. His heart hammered like it was trying to escape his ribs. He laughed once, short, breathless, almost hysterical. That was too close. But it was done. Above him, the stars began to emerge, sharp and cold through the branches. James straightened slowly, his expression hardening as the softness drained from it. The visit had changed nothing, and everything. By morning, his father's men would notice the questions Diep couldn't answer. The rumors would shift. The pressure would increase. The old man would tighten his grip. Good. James reached for his backpack and pulled out the notebook. By the light of a small, shielded flame, he opened to a clean page. The handwriting this time was steadier, more deliberate. He added new notes, new names, new timelines. If his father wanted a war, he would get one. But this war would be fought on James's terms. And when it was over, when the empire fell and the forest no longer needed to hide him, James would return, not as a fugitive, not in silence, but openly. For her, James, the fugitive son of a powerful man, has been hiding in the forest while secretly planning a war to dismantle his father's empire. Despite knowing the danger, he risks everything to return to the village for one brief forbidden visit to Diep, the woman he loves and is trying to protect. Carrying a crooked bouquet of wildflowers, he picked himself. James slips into her bamboo house, silently leaving the flowers beside her pillow, before disappearing again into the night. His visit nearly exposes him to his father's men, but he escapes back into the forest alive. The encounter strengthens his resolve rather than weakening it. By the firelight, James resumes his plans with renewed focus, determined to destroy the empire that threatens Diep's safety and return one day not as a fugitive, but as a man who has finally won her freedom.